Today is the 28th of April, 2005. I'm at Barbara Limanowska's apartment. I have a question. Could you tell us about yourself, about your life, about how feminism found its place in your life, and what place it found, where it came from? Was it a person or an event that made you at some point become one of the most active and well-known feminists in Poland?
Okay, so you just want me to tell you everything all at once, right?
Yes, you may start with anything in your life.
I mean, I'd rather start later in life, because I'm a bit tired of all these early childhood stories about how I preferred running and playing ball to playing with dolls. In reality, my first awareness, first conscious contact with feminism was most likely through Ewa Franus, my friend from college, and was rather late. At some point during my junior or even senior year, so it was kind of toward the end. Before that, it was more intuitive. I either liked something or not. But it was more about some sense of social justice, really. The idea that one shouldn't simply do things because it was unjust. And so for Ewa, these were more serious conversations. Ewa was... I don't really know if she attended Renata Siemińska's seminars, or if she only knew girls who attended Siemińska's seminars. But she certainly was in touch with them. And she was immersed in these ideas, and in this way of thinking that was developing there. And Ewa was from Warsaw, and she was often going there and then coming back to college in Poznan. And she'd bring me some written stuff. And she was educating me. And it was a kind of a learning from somebody, learning through an intermediary, you know, because Ewa herself was the kind of person who was getting involved in all of this. And she was kind of passing it on to me, both information and literature. And I think it wasn't as much through people as it was through books.
You used the expression written stuff. Was it feminist written stuff?
Yes, yes. You know, at that point, it was completely inaccessible and unknown. And because of that, when she brought these things, it created an impression of some news from another world.
What, for example?
Well, I can't really tell you, since I don't quite remember. There was this book, and it made perhaps the biggest impression on me then. It was perhaps the first one I read with full awareness, understanding of what I was reading. The only thing is I don't remember the author's name. It was an English book whose title was The Skeptical Feminist. When I think about it now, I believe it generally wasn't the best feminist book. But it was interesting in a sense that it was a good reading for beginners. I mean, it was the kind of book that explained feminism in a very gentle and balanced way. Kind of starting out with the idea that feminism wasn't about hating men and being a very radical person, but rather it was about some basic principles of social justice and equality. And I might have needed this then. I mean, this gentle entry, which would allow me to justify my interest in my own eyes. And well, that's how it perhaps started. And later on with Ewa, we also... I would come here to Warsaw and meet girls who had just participated in these Siemińska seminars. The group that later founded the Women's Center or the Polish Feminist Association.
And when was that, approximately?
Well, it must have been around 1980, maybe 82 or 83.
And is this when your feminist activism started?
Well, not really, not activism. Because what kind of activism was it when the only action perhaps that was going on then was this? Must have been 1982 or even 1983, since I was already working at the Art History Institute. And this activism was about sitting around at the institute and arguing. We were arguing because I was trying to explain to everybody that they knew nothing about the world and that the only proper way of thinking was the feminist way. Yes, it was this kind of a period for discussing things and converting others. Because I looked and saw the light, it seemed to me that it was enough to say 3 sentences to others and they would understand as well, since it was so simple and so obvious. It was a kind of period of this great naivete, which was actually quite fun. But, well, that's what our activism boiled down to, since there was really no social activism. Were we doing something in Poznan? There was one action in Poznan, but I participated in it. eFKa was doing it, and I participated more as an onlooker than an organizer. But I don't quite remember what exactly it was, but it certainly was a trip. The one thing I remember are banners. Oh, I know. During the strikes at the Poznan University in 1981, while the strike was going on, some huge posters appeared, which exhorted people to accept feminism, to change the system, and they were in the same convention as all the other posters, on brown packing paper. And I remember that I was shocked then, and I had this impression that, well, that the girls were really pushing it too far, that the country was in need, we wanted to change the system, the Russians were at the border, and here we were doing some radical actions. And most likely nothing else was going on then. It was only later, after my leaving for Holland, that there were first real organized actions, apart from these meetings of this feminist group, in which I rarely participated. They were going on in Warsaw, after all. So later on, while in Amsterdam, also with Eva Franus, we helped organize a festival of women's films. It was perhaps my first serious involvement in feminist activism. In other words, it wasn't just about thinking and reviewing things, but also an attempt to do something.
It was this film festival in Warsaw, right?
Yeah, it was. It was done together with Roman Gutek. And it was a really good festival, really very interesting, and also incredibly radical for that time period. We managed to get to very many films. At that point, few films were generally shown in Poland. I mean, these engaged films from the West. And through feminist distributors, which at that point followed different rules. I mean, they weren't so commercial yet and didn't want money for everything. We managed to get to really good film works. And these girls would give us everything for free, and would even help us in organizing and sending this stuff, so that the program was really very interesting.
And on a more personal note, did anything happen in relation to this festival?
No, little happened to me personally, apart from the fact that we had to go places and beg a lot. But I didn't participate in the festival itself, since I was in Holland illegally at this point and couldn't come to Poland. Besides, there was still martial law, I think, right? So if I had come, they wouldn't have most likely let me back out. And this was what I didn't want at all. So I didn't take part in the festival itself. We took care of getting the films and preparing materials for publication that was brought out with the festival.
This festival was your first big feminist work, right?
Yes.
And what happened then?
Gosh. Well, then... We then had this idea, since Dorota Roszkowska joined us in Amsterdam. And we had this idea to somehow help those girls who were still in Poland.
W jaki sposób pomagać tym dziewczynom, które były w Polsce.
Since the biggest problem then was this lack of contacts and possibilities to start any contacts and any exchange of information between Eastern Europe and women's organizations in the West. And there were very many organizations in Western Europe which were interested in contacts, cooperation and support for what was going on in Eastern Europe. But somehow these contacts didn't exist at all. There was no internet yet, so letters had to be written and such. But it was also due to some political fear, you know, that it can be labeled as some political activity. It was also perhaps due to some kind of lack of experience and lack of knowledge and simply ineptitude in searching for these types of contacts. And also at that point it was, so it seemed to us we could do something useful, because it was still the time when it was possible to do an awful lot in Poland for $100. Basically, you didn't really need any real cash in the Western sense, because $100 in Poland was a lot of money then. So it was just after that, for relatively little money from the West, it was possible to do a lot in Poland. And we were trying to figure out how, from whom, and from where to get some money that we could pass on to Poland for some kind of activism. And to some extent we succeeded, but not as much as we wanted. It turned out that what we really failed at was initiating some long-term institutional contacts. And our main goal was to start some cooperation that would be continued. And then we also, I really think, at least when I'm thinking about it now, it seems to me we had this... We were thinking about ourselves as younger sisters of Western feminism, with all the baggage of this. I mean, and with the lack of experience and a will, a kind of image that when we find things out and when we talk to these women from there, we'll find out everything and we'll understand everything. But also with the kind of expectation that help should come. Because if this feminism was to be such a wonderful sisterhood movement, which was about solidarity among women, they should, of course, help us somehow, right? So it was this kind of thinking, well, not always based on rational premises. It was more like hope for what it should be like than a real reflection of reality. In spite of this, however, some projects started at that time were somehow successfully finished. Among other things, it was then, after all, that PFA started contacts with something called Frauenanstiftung, which was this first real help. And it was really very significant. This cooperation with the Germans, I think, and particularly during the 1980s, was incredibly important. It had a very big impact on what was happening here. And other things were perhaps less so. But apart from this, a lot of things were happening without us. Because the next thing, the next sphere of influence, it was Ansnido and this thing that was later called Network of East-West Women. So to wrap it up, it was this very real kind of help, right?
You were also participating in this somewhat, right?
No, not really. I mean, I was there at this first meeting in Dubrovnik, so I kind of took part in doing all of this. But I wasn't particularly involved.
Nie byłam w to specjalnie zaangażowana. To się już później
Later on, it was going on between the United States and Eastern Europe, above all else, perhaps.
Wschodnią Polską przede wszystkim chyba.
And I was still in Amsterdam, so it was kind of happening without me.
And what was it that kept you in Amsterdam?
In Amsterdam? In Amsterdam?
Well, since this whole feminist thing was happening here, in Poland, and it was important for you, but on the other hand...
Well, but not only that. As for Amsterdam, I ended up there without really knowing where I was going and what I was doing, since I was just going there for a 2-week vacation. And I ended up in Rozengracht squats, completely unaware of what it was and where I was. I had no clue. I generally had no idea that something like this existed. I couldn't even imagine that something like this could exist, right? It was the very idea of this kind of disobedience, that people could do whatever they felt like, you know, and this way they could try changing the world was completely alien to me. From this orderly Poland, and I mean the rules of the old system, you know, from this kind of perspective, it was something completely unthinkable. And when I saw this, there was no way I could leave it, because...
What was so fascinating about it?
Well, I didn't quite get what it was about. I saw these people. I kind of saw they were really trying to live following their own principles, right? I mean, some internalized own principles, not external ones, but really kind of highly internalized. And they were able to create a real social movement based on this. Something that we didn't have at all, after all. And that they had some sort of ideals. These were simply things which had no right to happen in the real world. The one I knew, simply because they were prohibited. Well, no, it wouldn't even occur to anybody that it was possible to do something like this. And for a long time, I mean, at the beginning, for the first few months, it was like... Of course, when I saw this, I was so fascinated. There was no way... It didn't even occur to me to just leave it and go back to my orderly world, right? It was particularly because then, from that vantage point, this world really seemed very stable and orderly. The kind of world where you could imagine your future in 20 or 30 years.
What year was that?
It must have been 1983, the beginning, the first years of martial law. With this kind of, without any real oppression, right? You know, political oppression, since things had already calmed down kind of fast. But there was this feeling that nothing could ever happen again. And that everything would just be, you know, rules and norms and vron and pron. I don't know, whatever they decide. And there it suddenly turned out that it wasn't the case. That the world was not so orderly, not the same, but it was completely different. And this, I know it sounds odd, but, well, it was a shock for me, a kind of the biggest surprise of my life. But as I've already started saying, at the beginning, I was incredibly skeptical, and I was suspecting a major hoax, because it was completely impossible that something like this was even possible, right? Because of that, I definitely approached the whole affair with a lot of skepticism. And I reasoned with myself that I should stay in order to understand what the whole thing was really about, right? I didn't want to be left with this fascination and with a sense that in leaving Amsterdam I lost something big. But I would figure it out first. I would understand it and see what it was. But later when I would find out it wasn't really so great, I would go back. And it turned out to be great, since I stayed there for almost 10 years.
So the squats tempted you?
Well, no, the squats were changing, but this environment, this atmosphere. Well, the atmosphere of Amsterdam was also changing. Since I happened to be there during the last moments of of what was known as squatters, of this big Dutch movement of squatters. Later on, very soon, it started looking different. But I still managed to be a part of this. But I don't know if I answered your question, because I don't remember what the question was anymore.
The question was, what was it that fascinated you so much?
Yeah, that's what fascinated me so much.
You stayed there for 10 years and then you returned to Poland, right?
Well, yes.
And what did you do when you came back?
You know, things were already quite different at that point because it was after 1989. And it turned out that it was possible to do more in Poland than there. And this paradigm of emigration for political and social reasons, involving some immigration activism, simply ceased to make sense. And this kind of self-justification that here, in the free space, I could do more to help my oppressed sisters who stayed home was just off the wall. It just didn't work out. It made no sense. And I was aware that it was kind of possible to do a lot of things in Poland, that things were changing, that this was the time. After all, at that point, I think, and it wasn't just me, we were all hoping that these social political changes would be moving more in the direction of this progressive social ideal than what actually did happen. So then at least that's how I remember it in my talks with Eva at that point, but also with other girls. There was this sense that it was a real chance to popularize feminism and turn it into a piece of this new social order. The best evidence is Małgosia Tarasiewicz, who really believed that being in Solidarity at that time and creating women's sections there made sense, and that it was obvious something like this was bound to happen. I think that, to a certain extent, we all imagined it like this, that there would finally be room to talk about women's rights and about how women were supposed to function in this new society. And well, later on it turned out, well, that we didn't predict how it all could. Most likely we didn't have experience, knowledge, and in general, this kind of political thinking ability. But anyway, it all happened differently. But after all, there were hopes and kind of great sense that it was possible to do things in Poland. It was all very strong. So it kind of made no sense to just sit around in Amsterdam, because the world was already elsewhere. And what was interesting was already happening outside of Amsterdam. Also, at that point, Amsterdam had already become more orderly. It started getting more conservative, respectable, quiet.
After a short stay in Poland, another break happened, and you went to Thailand for 2 years. Where did this come from?
Yes. Well, it was, above all else, I think it simply turned out I wasn't able to go back to Poland just like that and just live here. And after a few months, I don't think I wanted to either.
Did you have a feeling that...
I mean, well, it's kind of hard for me to say. I really don't quite know. Because I don't think there were some political reasons, for example, and some disappointment with how the situation was developing, because I think that at that point I hadn't, or we hadn't, I should say, yet developed this sense, this ability of looking at things from a distance and evaluating them. Something odd was going on there, and everything looked a bit different, a bit sadder and a bit more stupid than we had expected. But apart from that, it wasn't possible to just say things were going wrong. And I didn't quite like it, so I was just going away. Well, it wasn't quite like this. But at the same time, there was this feeling of claustrophobia I most likely had after going back to this small social environment. And basically so little was going on. Well, on the other hand, things were going on since the Beijing conference was held, after all, and things were happening before the conference. So I lasted till the conference, and then I just left.
What were you working on in Thailand?
It was still before Thailand, in 1993, I think, when Teresa Oleszczuk and I got involved in founding La Strada. It was this kind of the first wave or first news about the existence of something like trafficking in women in Eastern Europe. There was a Dutch organization, Stichting tegen Vrouwenhandel, which looked for contacts with organizations in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Poland and in Czechoslovakia, because it was still Czechoslovakia at that point.
What year was that?
Somewhere around 1990, 91, perhaps 1992. Well, no, it may have already been
1991, perhaps.
Anyway, I don't know, somewhere around then. They wanted to initiate contacts because they didn't know what to do with women from Eastern Europe who ended up in shelters and should be sent home, but it was unclear how to do it. And Teresa and I somehow got involved into trying to do something about it in Poland. And it was kind of related to what the Polish Feminist Association was doing. We kind of did it on behalf of the association. La Strada was created. And at the same time, I had some contacts with organizations working against women trafficking in other places. Among other things, something like GAATW was created. It was an international global organization, as the name indicates, and it was located in Bangkok. And they offered me some work on the project, which was supposed to look for links and trace certain mechanisms of human trafficking in Eastern Europe and Asia. We had this idea to go beyond the first world, beyond the language and methodology, which kind of reflected Western feminist imagination, to look at it from some Eastern vantage point and to try to describe this phenomenon to work on it kind of from the inside, from our perspective, without appropriating or accepting the language which, as we felt, didn't quite reflect what was really going on in trafficking. At this point, it was already kind of, since after all, already in Beijing, there were terrible fights and discussions between the abolitionist option and this, let's say, human rights option. There were terrible fights. And at the same time, it seemed to us that it was much more about economic issues, about immigrants' rights, and about the need to look at what's happening to people in this whole process of migration. or work exploitation than it was about some big philosophical discussions. And we worked on this project for 2 years. In the beginning, in Bangkok, we did this conference, Asia, Eastern Europe, about trafficking, and later on, we also had meetings, seminars, and contact talks between organizations in Asia and Europe. We had a series of meetings and training sessions in a few countries in Eastern Europe. Also later, after I got back from Bangkok, we were still organizing these meetings in Eastern Europe. And it was important because while in Bangkok, we weren't really terribly successful in doing things without this Western influence, because Ali Miller was there with us. She was then with the International Human Rights Law Group, and Ali had a huge influence on what was going on. But we created this more of a human rights paradigm, and it was much more adequate, it seemed to us, or more adequately reflected the situation in trafficking than these theoretical disputes. Well, and later on, we were trying to have a conversation about this paradigm and to see how this way of thinking would be received in Eastern Europe. Well, and it is a similar way of doing things and thinking to those of La Strada. So, but to what extent was La Strada under the influence of what GAATW did? It's hard for me to say. It's possible that GAATW was more under the influence of La Strada. What we did was a result of La Strada's work in various countries, and we were just trying to somehow link it together. It was also when the first training manual was created. We made it to enable people to talk about and explain what trafficking in women was. And what could be done about it. So it was a very interesting project, I have to say. Now, in retrospect, it was still very imperfect. But at the same time, it already included all the main elements that are still being debated till this day. So for the next 10 years, we came up with very few new things when it comes to human trafficking. This thing in Bangkok and the first years of GAATW were really quite significant. And then I came back.
And this time, what was it to?
From, rather than to.
From.
Because I didn't really know what I was coming back to. I mean, after 2 years in Thailand, I figured out I couldn't stay on in Thailand. And it was both for personal and cultural reasons. It's probably my stupidity, naivete, and lack of understanding of the world, but I needed 2 years to understand that there were deep cultural differences between Poland and Thailand, and that I wouldn't probably be able to overcome them, and that living there as a complete outsider, who had no contact and no understanding of daily life, was too difficult. It seemed to me, I felt like this, while in Holland I never felt like this. In Holland I felt at home since the first day, so language issues and other traditions seemed kind of secondary, as if they didn't matter. But in Thailand it turned out that it completely overcame me. The longer I stayed there, the more I realized I would never get access to this world. It was too much. Besides, I also began to realize that I would need to start working at some point to make some money before retirement, because I was already 40. And it turned out that if I didn't start working somewhere, I wouldn't get any retirement, because I wouldn't be able to work this mandatory minimum of 20 years. So this was another reason I was thinking that, unfortunately, I had to go back and start some normal life rather than this abnormal life. And I came back with this resolution, to start being serious, you know, so to speak. The country is free, so it's possible to find something for myself. And years are passing. And so it's time to think about some stability. And that's what happened.
What did the stability look like in your case?
Well, stability looked like this. I won a contest for the director of eFKa, the information center for women's groups in Warsaw. And I got my stability in a director's position. No, and it was, I think, was a really neat kind of stability, because I also managed to stabilize my daily life.
Ustabilizowania życia codziennego.
We rented a house with Ella and her daughter, and it was this kind. At least it gave us a sense that we had not become totally normal, and that it wasn't just a bourgeois stability, but it was about something else. But at the same time, there was a kind of peace and security, and a salary, yes, it was really good for us. And it was, I think, a really neat time. When I managed to really do a lot. I have a feeling that we really managed to create not an institution as much, but rather a new way of thinking about the women's movement, much more transparent, clear, and based on the exchange of information, so that people wouldn't have a feeling that there were some separate little groups, that it was unclear who did what and why, but rather that it was really based on certain principles, and that it became more of a formalized movement. I think that at that time it was very much needed and useful somehow. To wrap it up, we all reached stability, right? In this messy situation, well...
Your director's position in Poland lasted for a few years, right?
Till 2001.
And then? Then what?
And later on, I went to Sarajevo. Again to work on prevention of women trafficking. I surprised myself to some extent, because every time there were periods of time when I worked on trafficking, because something needed to be done. But then I would leave it, because it got me too upset, and it really demanded too much from me. It was the hardest part of being a feminist, because the most fun is just about some theoretical gabbing about what could be done, should be done, or even better about what somebody else should do, but didn't and why. You could go on. And here was really, there were situations when this trafficking stuff really demanded a lot of emotional involvement, and it was much harder. Well, but somehow I got involved again, because there was some Balkan project, and they were looking for somebody with Eastern European experience, somebody who could help them describe the situation.
It's a very difficult place, and you had direct contact with perpetrators and victims. What was your work about?
Oh. The place was not that difficult anymore, because it was a few years after the war, so let's not exaggerate. Oh, these Balkans. When I was going there, I almost got myself a bulletproof vest out of conviction that I was really going to the end of the world. But in reality, it was much calmer and more normal. But the fact also is that it was the reality after the conflict, very different from ours here, and much harder for the people. I think that it was only then that I began to get it about how huge the differences were in Eastern Europe itself, between individual countries. And it wasn't just about differences in material resources, but in general about access to the New World and the Western world. How much we differed among ourselves. It also confirmed, I mean, it was a repetition of my thinking about emigration from the late 1970s or early 1980s in Poland. When people had a feeling that nothing was ever going to happen here, that it was all just total shit, and they just needed to split, and they tried their best to do it, and they saw the ideal of this beautiful, wonderful world somewhere abroad. And there it turned out it was the same all over again. And it was similar. Well, besides, socially, it was all kind of much harder, because you could feel this baggage of a few years of war. And human trafficking was a part of this whole thing. But it was done kind of on two levels. One thing was regular smuggling of people, illegal immigrants, who could get to Western Europe, who couldn't get to Western Europe any other way. And this, particularly in the first years, 1997, 98, and later on when I was already there, more or less till 2002, it was really happening on a large scale. And part of that was, in fact, human trafficking. I still can't say to what extent, because the trafficking issue, or rather the interpretation of what is called human trafficking, is so politicized and used to create these anti-migration phobias and to introduce anti-migration policies, so that I still don't know to what extent trafficking is a real, I mean that it happens on a large scale. And to what extent it's simply an urban legend, or some made-up scary story. Like we had this story about a black Volga that used to be told, about kids being snatched into these cars. It's the same now in the Balkans. They also snatch children and cut out their organs. They do it in Turkey or something. But really, to what extent it's the truth, I don't know. But at any rate, there was enough to do there. Well, no, there was actually one more issue. The migration issue is one thing, but the second issue here is also interesting. And here the Balkans were really a very unique place. After the conflict, the UN troops were stationed there first, and now the EU troops are there. And because of this, a huge sex industry has popped up.
Powstał wielki przemysł seksualny.
I mean, lots of clubs have been opened, and brothels, and places for the soldiers and for representatives of all international organizations. The appearance of all these people and all these international organizations has brought about some influx of cash and the intention to make money on them. So this is the second issue explaining why the Balkans became so... And well, for 4 years, and actually the last project has ended right now. I have been working on this. The last one was a report. A third one in a row, which we have just recently presented in March about the situation in the region.
Where?
Where were we presenting it, you mean? Well, these were some international... You know, the promotion was held in Geneva. It was organized by the regional office of UNICEF. And apart from that, there were promotional activities in all the countries of the region. It was organized by OSCE offices in these countries, since it was a joint project of UNICEF, OSCE, and perhaps also High Commissioner for Human Rights.
I would still like to go back to what you said in the beginning. Feminism has found a fertile soil in your sensitivity to social issues. It has kind of grown in this soil. But where did it come from, this kind of sensitivity? Could you say that it was your closest environment, your family, or friends, or school? Where did this kind of sensitivity come from in your case? Do you have any sense of what the sources were for this?
No, I don't. I don't know what it is.
Is it your individual trait? Or is it perhaps from your family, friends, or school? Where does something like this come from? Let's say not everybody has something like this.
It seems to me, well, it seems to me that perhaps...
Not everybody's a feminist, for example. Not everybody's a social activist.
Well, no, not everybody is kind of... I mean, you know, I was myself close. I would have never become a feminist in my life, since as far as I remember myself from high school and what kind of views I had then. When I have those little glimpses of discussions I had with some people, it's amazing that I didn't end up at some radical right-winger, dutifully convinced that I was always right and mine was the only way. It's just a coincidence. I could have just as well figured out it worked for me and could have been sure it was the only right way and one could do things only this way. A sense of justice most likely comes from reading Winnetou, since I don't recall any other readings. It's Winnetou for sure. And later on, this kind of social openness. I think it comes from my studies at the Art History Institute, which really gave me a lot. But that was actually on a kind of general level, you know, as some kind of permission to think and this kind of infusion of knowledge and information about how one could observe and interpret the modern world. My institute was really a very open place, and I think it was very different from what was going on in art history in other places. We were really lucky at the institute. Well, there was simply, you know, this kind of social radicalism, which was taken for granted, since it was the way to go. When we knew that the artistic revolution of the 1970s, which above all else was a rebellion against the given norms and the old order,
występowała przede
was the
wszystkim
only option we could accept.
staremu porządkowi. Jest jedyną opcją, którą możemy zaakceptować. No to jakby model
So this kind of revolution paradigm in culture, in general, was also the only option that made sense. And it was all very convincing.
I to było bardzo przekonywujące, bo myśmy
We actually had a lot of this kind of reading and this post-1968 kind of thinking.
lektur
And the stuff that popped up in the West but was barely squeezing through to us.
pojawiało się.
We actually had a lot of this.
się przemykało. Myśmy akurat bardzo dużo mieli. I myśmy tak
We, and this is what I think, we were rather strongly convinced that only this paradigm of openness and this constant transformation was useful and somehow appropriate and socially responsible.
Że tylko model takiej otwartości i takiej ciągłej zmiany jest użyteczny, czy jakoś tam odpowiedni, odpowiedzialny społecznie.
We were all really into it then. So I really don't understand why my male and female friends didn't become feminists. I think this was a very, very clear path.
In your case, there was also Ewa on the way, together with her feminist written stuff. Are you still somehow in touch? Are you still communicating?
Bardzo rzadko. Z Ewą ostatnio widziałam się
Very rarely.
lata temu.
The last time I saw Eva was 4 years ago, when I was in Warsaw.
Ewa jest ciągle
As far as I know, she's still in Amsterdam,
między Holandią a Francją.
or she's commuting somewhere between Holland and France. She kind of never felt this need to return and start on fundamentals of community work. She was more interested in theoretical thinking.
Takie myślenie teoretyczne.
And also, Eva was much more interested in art history, in working with art, than I was.
Historią sztuki.
There were so many social issues to take care of that I had no time left for art.
Było tyle ważnych spraw społecznych
Ewa.
do załatwienia, że już nie miałam czasu na
Work in
sztukę.
Poland, right?
Well, yes. And Eva had time.